My husband Richard had been dead for 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. I knew the exact count because I marked each day on the calendar in the kitchen, a small, neat X in the corner of each square. It was a ritual that felt necessary, a way to measure the growing distance between the life I had and the one I was now living. The house had become a museum of his absence. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His favorite worn armchair still held the faint indentation of his body. I moved through the rooms like a curator, preserving the silence, dusting memories I could no longer touch. The grief was a physical weight, a permanent cloak I wore that made my shoulders ache and my steps heavy. It was a quiet, private suffering. The day of the funeral had been a blur of black suits and hushed, inadequate words. My son, Mark, had stood beside me, his hand a rigid weight on my elbow, guiding me as if I were a piece of fragile glass. My daughter, Sarah, had wept theatrically into a handkerchief, her grief loud and performative. Friends and neighbors had murmured their condolences, their eyes filled with a pity that felt more like a dismissal. They spoke of Richard in grand, sweeping terms, a pillar of the community, a devoted family man. I had simply nodded, the words washing over me. The truth of our 40 years together was far more complicated than their eulogies, a tapestry of comfortable routines, quiet disappointments, and a love that had long ago settled into a kind of gentle, unbreakable habit. The official cause of death was a sudden, massive heart attack while on a fishing trip alone. He was gone before he hit the ground, they said. It was a mercy, they said. I wasn't so sure. My children treated me with a new kind of carefulness after he was gone. They called every day, their voices laced with a strained concern that felt more like duty than affection. They managed the estate, the life insurance, the paperwork that my grieving mind couldn't possibly handle. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had taken over the finances with a brisk efficiency that left no room for my input. Sarah would bring over casseroles I didn't eat and suggest I join a grief support group, as if my sorrow was a problem to be solved, a messy inconvenience to be tidied away. They saw me not as their mother, but as a relic of a life that had ended, a problem to be managed until I, too, faded away. I was the keeper of the house, the tender of the grave, the living monument to their father's memory. That was my role now. I was expected to be sad and quiet and frail. For 6 months I was. Then came yesterday. It was a Thursday, the day I did the weekly grocery shopping. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket hummed their monotonous song. The air smelled of chilled produce and floor cleaner. I was in the canned goods aisle reaching for a tin of crushed tomatoes when I saw him. He was standing by the display of imported olives, his back mostly to me. It wasn't a conscious thought at first, just a jolt, a current of recognition that shot through me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. It was the way he stood, with his weight shifted slightly to his left leg. It was the shape of his head, the silvering hair at his temples. He turned slightly to speak to the woman beside him, and I saw his profile. The world stopped. The can of tomatoes in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. It was Richard. It was not someone who looked like him. It was not a trick of the light or a phantom of my grief. It was him. He was thinner, his face leaner, and his hair was a little longer than he used to wear it, but it was him. The line of his jaw, the slight hook of his nose, the way his left eyebrow arched a fraction higher than his right. These were details etched into my memory, as familiar to me as the lines on my own hands. He was laughing, a low, quiet sound that I felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled across the polished linoleum floor and up into my bones. The woman with him was younger, maybe in her late 30s, with sleek dark hair and a bright, easy smile. She touched his arm as she laughed, a gesture of casual intimacy that sent a shard of ice through my chest. He looked at her with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, a soft, unguarded fondness that was both deeply familiar and utterly alien. He looked happy. He looked alive. My mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the impossible. A doppelganger? A long-lost twin he'd never mentioned? Every rational explanation felt flimsy, a paper shield against the terrifying certainty growing in my gut. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to call out his name, to shatter the mundane scene with the force of my shock, but my voice was gone, trapped in my throat. My limbs felt disconnected, my hands numb. I gripped the handle of my shopping cart, my knuckles turning white, the cold metal the only thing tethering me to reality. They started to move, pushing their cart toward the checkout lanes. A primal, unthinking impulse took over. I had to know. I had to be sure. I abandoned my own cart in the middle of the aisle, the tin of tomatoes rolling out and clattering to the floor. I didn't look back. I followed them. I kept my distance, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt like a ghost, invisible in the bustling store. They paid for their groceries, the woman swiping a credit card while Richard bagged the items with a practiced ease. I watched his hands, the long, capable fingers I knew so well. He had a small, crescent-shaped scar on his left wrist, a souvenir from a foolish attempt to fix a lawnmower when he was a teenager. It was a tiny, intimate detail of his body, a map point of our shared history. He was wearing a long-sleeved shirt. I couldn't see it. They walked out into the bright afternoon sun. I fumbled for my car keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the ignition. My car, my familiar, safe sedan, felt like a stranger's. I waited until their car, a modest blue sedan I didn't recognize, pulled out of the parking lot. Then, on pure instinct, I followed. I drove like a novice, staying 2 car lengths behind, terrified of being seen, more terrified of losing them. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and a cold, rising dread. If this was him, what did it mean? The funeral, the death certificate, the condolences, my children's grief, was it all a lie? The thought was so monstrous, so monumental, that my brain refused to fully form it. He drove calmly, obeying the speed limit, using his turn signals. It was so normal, so mundane, that it made the situation feel even more surreal. We drove for 15 minutes, away from our side of town, into a newer development of tidy, respectable-looking houses with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. My own neighborhood was old, filled with sprawling brick houses and ancient oak trees. This place felt sterile, anonymous. Their car turned onto a quiet cul-de-sac and pulled into the driveway of a small beige house with cheerful blue shutters. It looked like a doll's house. I parked my car down the street, my engine off, partially hidden by the low-hanging branches of a willow tree. I watched as they got out of the car. He lifted the grocery bags from the trunk, and the woman unlocked the front door. Before going inside, she turned back to him. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. It wasn't a perfunctory peck. It was a long, lingering kiss, full of affection and familiarity. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. It was a gesture of a man completely at home. Then they went inside, and the blue door closed, leaving me alone in the silent car, staring at a house I had never seen before, my world completely and irrevocably shattered. I sat there for a long time, the engine cold, the sun beginning to set, trying to breathe. The drive home was a blur. I navigated the familiar streets on autopilot, my mind a blank slate of shock. When I walked back into my house, the silence I had once found comforting now felt suffocating, menacing. The museum of Richard's absence was no longer a place of quiet grief. It was a crime scene, and I was the only one who didn't know the truth. Every photograph on the mantelpiece seemed to mock me. There we were, smiling on our wedding day. There we were with Mark and Sarah as toddlers, a perfect family portrait. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed, elaborate lie. My first coherent thought was to call my son. I needed to tell someone. I needed someone to tell me I was crazy, that I had imagined it all. My hands were still shaking as I dialed Mark's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and impatient. "Mom, is everything okay?" "Mark," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "I saw him. I saw your father." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy, loaded silence. Then he sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Mom, we've been over this. You're grieving. It's normal to think you see people who are gone. Dr. Evans said—" "No," I interrupted, a flicker of anger cutting through the fog of my shock. "This wasn't like that. It was him. I followed him. He's living in a house on the other side of town, with a woman." I gave him the address, the words tumbling out of me, desperate for him to believe me. His response was immediate and dismissive. "Mom, you followed a stranger? You can't do things like that. It's not safe. You're upset. You're not thinking clearly." His tone was the one he used when I couldn't figure out the new remote control for the television. Patronizing, condescending. He was treating me like a senile old woman. "I am thinking clearly," I insisted, my voice rising. "It was him, Mark. I know it was." "Okay, Mom, okay," he said, his voice softening into a placating croon. "Look, I'm busy at work right now. Why don't you lie down, take one of your pills? I'll call you tonight. We'll talk about it then. Just stay home. Don't go anywhere." He was humoring me. He thought I was having a breakdown, a delusion brought on by grief. The conversation ended with him promising to check on me later, a promise I knew was meant to pacify me, not to help me. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than ever. The person I had turned to for confirmation had just reinforced the idea that I was losing my mind. My next call was to Sarah. Perhaps she would be more understanding. She had always been the more emotional one, the one who claimed to be more in tune with feelings. Her reaction was even worse than Mark's. She listened to my frantic story, and when I was done, there was a long, drawn-out sigh. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "This is what I was worried about. You're not letting go. You're dwelling. Dad is gone. He's at peace. You need to accept that." "Sarah, I am telling you what I saw," I pleaded. "I saw him. He kissed her. They went into a house together." "You saw a man who looked like him," she corrected me gently, as if explaining a difficult concept to a child. "Your mind is playing tricks on you because you miss him so much. It happens. Maybe it's time we really looked into that support group, or maybe a nice trip somewhere, to get your mind off things." They were in perfect, maddening alignment. To them, my story was not a terrifying revelation. It was a symptom of my own fragility. They were not listening to my words. They were diagnosing my grief. They had already decided who I was, a grieving widow, confused and unreliable. Any evidence to the contrary was simply dismissed as part of my illness. I felt a profound and chilling isolation. I was trapped behind a wall of their certainty, my own reality denied, my voice silenced. They were so sure I was wrong, and their certainty was so absolute that for a terrifying moment, I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it? Was I so broken by grief that I had hallucinated an entire afternoon? The doubt gnawed at me through a long, sleepless night. I sat in Richard's armchair, the house dark around me, replaying the scene at the grocery store, the car journey, the kiss at the blue door. The details were too crisp, too clear to be a dream. The color of the woman's coat, the brand of orange juice in their cart, the chipping paint on the dollhouse's window frame. These were the mundane anchors of a real event. By morning, the doubt had receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. My children would not help me. They would not believe me. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. And I needed proof. Irrefutable proof that would shatter their patronizing dismissals. I knew what I had to do. I needed to see the scar. That small crescent-shaped mark on his left wrist was the one detail a doppelganger wouldn't have. It was my key. I showered and dressed with a deliberate, methodical slowness. I chose a plain gray coat and a dark scarf to cover my hair. I felt like a spy in a cheap novel, but the feeling of purpose was a welcome antidote to the helpless confusion of the day before. I drove back to the beige house with the blue shutters, my heart a steady, determined drum. I parked in the same spot as before, down the street under the willow tree. The blue sedan was in the driveway. I prepared myself for a long wait. I had brought a thermos of coffee and a book I had no intention of reading. For hours there was no activity. The house was quiet. I watched the windows, hoping for a glimpse of him. Around noon, the front door opened. It was him. He was wearing jeans and a dark green polo shirt, the short sleeves exposing his forearms. He was carrying a pair of gardening shears. My breath caught in my throat. He walked over to a rosebush near the front porch and began methodically snipping away dead blooms. He was turned toward me. I fumbled in my purse for the small pair of binoculars I had brought, a relic from bird-watching trips Richard and I had taken years ago. My hands trembled as I raised them to my eyes. The world swam into focus, blurry at first, then sharp. I focused on his left arm, his hand as it reached for a withered rose, and then I saw it. Faint, pale against his tanned skin, but undeniably there. A small, perfect crescent. The scar. A wave of something cold and sharp washed over me. It wasn't grief, it wasn't shock. It was a terrible, clarifying certainty. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It was him. Richard was alive. And everything, absolutely everything, had been a lie. The funeral, the heart attack, the fishing trip, my children's tears, my own 6 months of widowhood, a fraud, all of it. I slowly lowered the binoculars, the weight of the truth settling into my bones. The gaslighting from my children was no longer just patronizing, it was sinister. They weren't just mistaken, they were complicit. The thought landed with the force of a physical blow. They knew. Armed with this terrible, irrefutable knowledge, I drove straight to Mark's office. He was a partner in a mid-sized accounting firm, a place of glass walls and hushed, important-sounding conversations. I walked past the receptionist, who looked up in surprise and went straight to his office door, ignoring her calls to wait. I opened the door without knocking. He was on the phone, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, laughing at something the person on the other end had said. He saw me and his smile vanished. His face went pale. "I have to call you back," he said into the phone and hung up abruptly. "Mom, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" He stood up, his movement stiff and awkward. I didn't sit in the chair he gestured to. I stood in the middle of his sterile, impersonal office and looked at him. "I went back to the house," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I saw him in the garden. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. I saw the scar on his wrist, Mark." The color drained completely from his face. He looked trapped. The practiced, patronizing calm he had used on me before was gone, replaced by a raw, panicked denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Mom, you're not well. You're obsessing over this." "Stop it," I said, and the word was like a slap. "Stop lying to me. I am not crazy. I am not confused. And I am not grieving for a man who is alive and well and living in a beige house with blue shutters. Now you are going to tell me what is going on. You are going to tell me the truth." My voice didn't waver. The woman who had pleaded with him on the phone the day before was gone. In her place was someone he didn't recognize, someone who would not be dismissed. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked around his glass-walled office as if worried his colleagues were watching the carefully constructed world of Mark, a successful partner, a dutiful son, shatter. He sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "Mom, just leave it alone," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's better for everyone if you just let it go." "Better for whom, Mark?" I asked, the question cold and sharp. "Better for you? For Sarah? For him? It certainly isn't better for me. I have spent 6 months believing I was a widow. I buried an empty casket, didn't I?" His eyes flickered, a direct hit. He couldn't meet my gaze. He stared at a spot on his polished mahogany desk, at a silver pen holder, at anything but me. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. I didn't fill it. I just waited. I had all the time in the world. The quiet, persistent pressure was something he wasn't used to from me. I had always been the one to smooth things over, to keep the peace. Not anymore. Finally, he broke. It wasn't a sudden dam burst, but a slow, grudging leak. "It's complicated," he mumbled. "Dad, he was in trouble. Bad investments. He was going to lose everything, the house, the savings, all of it. He was facing ruin." The words hung in the air. This was the excuse, the justification for the monstrous lie. It was about money. Of course it was about money. "So he faked his death," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "The life insurance. That's what this was about. $1 million policy. Was that enough to set him up in a new life and pay off his debts?" Mark flinched as if I had struck him. He looked up at me then, his eyes pleading. "We didn't have a choice, Mom. He came to me and Sarah. He was desperate. He said it was the only way to protect the family, to protect you." The lie was so audacious, so insulting that I almost laughed. "To protect me?" I repeated, my voice dripping with an icy scorn I didn't know I possessed. "You protected me by letting me believe my husband of 40 years was dead? You protected me by having me mourn at a fake grave? You stood beside me at that funeral, holding my arm, and you knew he was alive. You looked me in the eye and you lied." Tears welled in his eyes. They were tears of self-pity, not remorse. "What was I supposed to do?" he cried, his voice cracking. "He's my father. He begged me. He said you were fragile, that the truth of the financial ruin would destroy you. He said this was kinder." "Kinder." I whispered the word. It tasted like poison. The full, staggering scope of their betrayal washed over me. It wasn't just Richard's deception. It was a conspiracy, and my own children were his chief accomplices. They had weighed my life, my sanity, my heart against a sum of money and a comfortable lie, and they had chosen the lie. They had decided I was too fragile to handle the truth of a financial problem, but strong enough to endure the agony of widowhood. The patronizing logic of it was breathtaking. They hadn't been protecting me. They had been managing me. I was a problem to be handled, an emotional obstacle in their path. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man he had become, and I felt nothing. The love, the maternal bond that had defined my life, was just gone. It had been hollowed out, scoured clean by the acid of their deceit. In its place was a vast, cold emptiness. This was the nadir, the absolute bottom. Sitting in his office, I realized I had no family. The people I called my children, the man I had called my husband, were strangers. They were conspirators who had built their new lives on the foundation of my grief. I had spent 40 years of my life dedicated to this family. I had sacrificed a career of my own to raise Mark and Sarah. I had managed the household, hosted the holidays, remembered the birthdays, soothed the fevers. I had been the steady, reliable center of their world, and my reward was to be cast as the fool in the final act of their drama, the unwitting victim whose grief funded the whole production. The pain was so immense it transcended tears. It was a cold, silent implosion in the center of my being. I felt the last of my sorrow burn away, like fog under a winter sun. And in its place, something new began to form. It was hard and clear and unbendable. It was resolve. I turned without another word and walked out of Mark's office. He called my name, his voice thick with panic. "Mom, wait, where are you going? What are you going to do?" I didn't answer. I didn't look back. I walked out of the building and into the afternoon light, my steps steady, my purpose clear. They thought I was fragile. They thought I was a relic to be managed. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The grieving widow was gone. I had buried her in that glass-walled office, right alongside the love I once had for my son. What walked out into the sunlight was someone else entirely, someone they had created. The first thing I did when I got home was make a pot of coffee. The simple, methodical act of measuring the grounds and water was grounding. As the coffee brewed, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, I sat at the table with a pen and a clean sheet of paper. I was not a victim anymore. I was a strategist. My mind, which my children had so easily dismissed as foggy and unreliable, was now shockingly clear. The emotions that had clouded my judgment for 6 months had evaporated, leaving behind a crystalline, logical landscape. I saw the whole sordid affair for what it was: a criminal conspiracy, insurance fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, forgery. My children thought I was ignorant about finances, a perception they and Richard had cultivated for years. It was true that Richard had always handled the investments, presenting me with summaries that I had trusted implicitly. But I wasn't stupid. I had managed a complex household budget for 4 decades. I knew how to read a statement. I knew where our assets were, or where they were supposed to be. The house was in both our names. So were several of our bank accounts. The power of attorney I had so trustingly signed over to Mark after the death suddenly seemed like a weapon they had turned against me. I spent the rest of the day online, not looking at old photos or reading sentimental posts, but conducting research. I searched for top-rated lawyers in the city, specializing not in family law but in financial fraud and estate litigation. I read reviews, looked at case histories, and compiled a short list. I needed someone sharp, unemotional, and ruthless. I was not looking for a shoulder to cry on. I was looking for a weapon. The next morning, I called the office of a woman named Eleanor Vance Davies. Her biography said she was a former federal prosecutor. That seemed promising. Her assistant was polite but firm, informing me that Ms. Davies had a full schedule. I said calmly and clearly, "Please tell Ms. Davies that I have credible evidence of a multi-million-dollar life insurance fraud scheme involving a fake death, and that the conspirators include my children, who hold my power of attorney." There was a brief silence. Then the assistant said, "Can you hold for 1 moment, please?" 2 minutes later, she came back on the line. "Ms. Davies can see you at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Ms. Davies' office was on the 30th floor of a downtown skyscraper. It was a corner office with panoramic views of the city, furnished in steel and black leather. It was a room that radiated power and competence. Miss Davies herself was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of complete, unshakable composure. She didn't offer condolences or platitudes. She offered me a seat and a glass of water, then sat opposite me behind her large, uncluttered desk. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice neutral. "Start from the beginning." And so I did. I told her the whole story, from the day of the fake funeral to seeing the scar on Richard's wrist through a pair of binoculars. I recounted my conversations with Mark and Sarah, their gaslighting, their dismissals. I told her about Mark's eventual partial confession. I spoke calmly, factually, without tears. I was not a grieving widow telling a sad story. I was a client presenting a case. She listened intently, her gaze never leaving my face. She took no notes, but I had the distinct impression she was recording every word in her mind. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. I expected skepticism, or at least a degree of professional caution. Instead, her eyes held a look of cold, professional anger. "What they have done to you, Mrs. Barrett," she said, her voice low and precise, "is not just a betrayal. It is a series of felonies, and they have profoundly underestimated you." That single sentence was the most validating thing anyone had said to me in years. She saw me, not as a fragile old woman, but as a person who had been wronged. "They have always underestimated me," I replied. "That will be their undoing," she said with a thin, sharp smile. "Here is what we are going to do. First, we revoke Mark's power of attorney, immediately. We will have a messenger deliver the revocation notice to his office this evening. Second, we gather our own evidence. Your testimony is powerful, but we need an airtight, documented case. I work with an excellent private investigator. With your permission, I will engage him to conduct surveillance on your husband and his new partner. We need photographs, video, and confirmation of the identity he is using. She continued, laying out the strategy with chilling clarity. Third, we contact the fraud divisions of both the life insurance company and the bank that holds your mortgage. We will do this carefully, presenting them with a preliminary file. They will launch their own investigations, which will be far more powerful than ours. They have subpoena power. They will trace the money. They will find out exactly where that insurance payout went. Fourth, and most importantly, we protect your assets. We will file to have all joint accounts frozen. We will put a lien against the house your husband is living in, assuming he purchased it with fraudulent funds. And you, Mrs. Barrett, are going to change your will. The last point landed with particular weight. My will, written years ago, left everything to be divided equally between Mark and Sarah. I want them disinherited, I said, the words tasting like freedom. Completely. Of course, Ms. Davies said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Do you have someone else you would like to name as your beneficiary? I thought of my grandson, Leo, Sarah's son. He was a freshman in college, a good-hearted, clever boy who was the only one in the family who called me for no reason, just to chat. He sent me funny videos and photos of his dog. He never asked for anything. He just seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. He saw me as his grandmother, not as a symbol or a burden. My grandson, I said. Leo. Excellent. Ms. Davies nodded. We will draft a new will and trust immediately. We will make it ironclad. I left her office feeling lighter. The weight of the grief had been replaced by the solid, satisfying weight of a plan. For the next 2 weeks, I became the quiet center of a storm of activity. The private investigator, a discreet man named Mr. Chen, began his work. He was efficient and invisible. He provided daily reports delivered in plain brown envelopes. The photographs were clinical and damning. Richard looking healthy and relaxed, mowing the lawn of the beige house. Richard and the woman, whose name was apparently Brenda, holding hands on a walk. Richard using a credit card in the name of Robert Franklin. Ms. Davis's team moved with surgical precision. The power of attorney was revoked. Mark's office received the notice by courier. He called me, his voice a mixture of fury and panic. What do you think you're doing? You can't do this. I didn't engage. All future communication can be directed to my lawyer, Mark, I said, and hung up. Sarah called, sobbing, accusing me of trying to destroy the family. You already destroyed it, Sarah, I told her calmly, and hung up on her too. The bank accounts were frozen. The new will was signed and notarized. Ms. Davies compiled a formidable file. Mr. Chen's surveillance photos and reports, copies of the fraudulent death certificate, the life insurance claim signed by Mark, and my own detailed affidavit. She presented it to the chief counsel of the insurance company. The reaction was, as she had predicted, swift and aggressive. A multi-million-dollar fraud was not something they took lightly. Their own investigators took over, and the case was soon referred to the district attorney's office. Things began to move with an inexorable, terrifying momentum. I had started a landslide. All I had to do now was stand back and watch it fall. The day of the reckoning came 3 weeks after my first meeting with Ms. Davies. She called me in the morning. The warrants have been issued, she said, her voice calm and businesslike. They will likely be executed this afternoon, at his residence and at your children's homes. She paused. I think it is time for a final family meeting. You deserve to be the one to tell them it's over. I agreed. It was not about revenge. It was about justice. It was about looking them in the eye and reclaiming the truth they had tried to steal from me. I called Mark. I called Sarah. I told them I needed to see them. At the house. Our house. At 3 o'clock. I told them it was urgent. There was a wary suspicion in their voices, but they agreed to come. They still thought they could manage me, that they could talk me down from this ledge of defiance. They arrived together, a united front. They walked into the living room, the room where we had celebrated so many Christmases and birthdays, and stood before me, their faces a mixture of apprehension and defiance. Mark spoke first. "All right, Mom, what is this? You've had your little tantrum. You've hired a lawyer. You've frozen the accounts. Are you done now? Are you ready to listen to reason?" I was sitting in my own armchair, not Richard's. I looked at them, my children, and felt a profound sense of distance, as if I were watching actors on a stage. "I am done," I said quietly. "I am done being lied to. I am done being managed. And I am done being your mother." Sarah scoffed, a nervous, dismissive sound. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We did what we had to do to protect this family. Dad was in trouble. You have no idea what it was like. The stress, the fear. We did it for you." "You did it for money," I corrected her, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You did it for yourselves. You sacrificed me on the altar of your own convenience and greed. You let me grieve for a living man. You let me wither in this house while you enabled his fantasy life. There is no defense for that. There is no justification." Mark took a step forward, his hands outstretched in a placating gesture. "Mom, please, let's just fix this. We can undo it. We'll pay the money back. We'll figure it out. We're a family." "No," I said, the word a final, unbreachable wall. "We are not a family. A family is built on trust and love. This," I gestured between the three of us, "was a business arrangement, and I was simply the asset you chose to liquidate. But the business is dissolved. Your power of attorney is revoked. The joint accounts are frozen. My will has been changed. You are no longer my beneficiaries. My grandson, Leo, will inherit everything." Their faces crumpled. The shock, the disbelief, the dawning horror. It was ugly to watch. Sarah started to sob. Real tears this time. Tears of loss and consequence. "You can't do that after everything we've done for you." "This is what you have done for me," I said, my voice rising for the first time, cold and clear as a bell. "You have taught me the difference between love and obligation. You have taught me that my own children see me as a fool. You have taught me that 40 years of my life were built on a foundation of lies. And for that lesson, I thank you. It was a late education, but a thorough one." As if on cue, the sound of cars pulling up outside broke the tense silence. Not one car, but several. Through the sheer curtains of the front window, I could see the flashing blue and red lights painting streaks across the lawn. The doorbell rang, a sharp, authoritative chime. Mark's face went ashen. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I told the truth," I said. "Something none of you have done in a very long time. I believe they are here for you and for your father. I imagine they are at his little beige house right now." I stood up. "I suggest you answer the door. This is your mess. You can clean it up." I turned and walked away from them. I did not watch as Mark, his body moving like a sleepwalker, went to the door. I did not stay to hear the voices of the police officers or the reading of the warrants. I walked through the dining room, into the kitchen, and out the back door into my garden. I knelt down by my rose bushes, the ones I had tended for years, and I began to methodically pull the weeds from the soil. I heard the sounds of my children being led away, their protests and cries muffled by the walls of the house. I did not look up. I just kept my hands in the dirt, feeling the cool, honest earth beneath my fingers. The storm had passed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was clean. The fallout was swift and brutal. The story became a local sensation, a lurid tale of suburban deceit. The man who attended his own funeral, one headline blared, Richard, or Robert Franklin as he was then known, was arrested at the beige house without incident. The woman, Brenda, claimed she had no idea he was a fugitive from his own life. She thought he was a widower, a retired consultant. Whether that was true or not, I didn't know or care. She was a footnote in a story that was never really about her. Richard, Mark, and Sarah were charged with a litany of crimes: conspiracy, insurance fraud, wire fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of paperwork, surveillance photos, and financial records. The insurance company, having recovered most of its money, pursued the case with a vengeance. They wanted to make an example of them. There was no trial. Faced with the mountain of evidence, they all took plea bargains. I followed the proceedings through Miss Davies, who provided me with concise, factual updates. Richard, whose health apparently was not as robust as it had appeared, suffered a genuine and fatal heart attack in his cell while awaiting sentencing. The irony was so bitter, it almost tasted sweet. He had faked his death for money, only to have the stress of his lies bring about a real one. There was no funeral this time. I felt nothing at the news. No grief, no satisfaction, just a quiet, distant finality. A chapter closed. Mark and Sarah were sentenced to 3 years in a low-security federal prison. Their lives were ruined. Mark lost his partnership, his reputation, and his wife, Jessica, who filed for divorce before the sentencing was even announced. Sarah lost her home and her social standing. Their friends, the ones who had offered me such pitying condolences, abandoned them. The beautiful, perfect family they had fought so hard to project to the world had been exposed as a hollow sham. I received letters from them from prison. Long, rambling letters filled with apologies, justifications, and pleas for forgiveness. They wrote of remorse and regret, of how they had learned their lesson. I read the first one from each of them, and then I stopped. Their words were meaningless to me. They were sorry they had been caught, not for what they had done. Forgiveness was a currency I no longer dealt in. It implied a future relationship, a path to reconciliation. There was no path. They had burned the bridge, salted the earth, and danced on the ashes. I instructed Ms. Davies to return all further correspondence unopened. My life, in contrast, became very quiet. The big house, once a museum of grief and then a crime scene, was now just a collection of empty rooms filled with bad memories. It felt heavy, haunted by the ghosts of lies. With Miss Davies' help, I sold it. I sold the furniture, the paintings, the silver, all the trappings of a life that was not my own. I kept only a few personal things: my books, my gardening tools, a small box of photographs of my parents, and a handful of Leo's childhood drawings. I bought a small, bright condominium in a different town, one with a large balcony that got the morning sun. It was clean and new and held no memories. I filled it with things that I chose, for me. A comfortable reading chair, a small, sturdy table for my baking, dozens of pots for plants. I started a container garden on the balcony, tomatoes, herbs, and a profusion of colorful geraniums. The work of tending them, of coaxing life from soil and seed, was a quiet joy. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vengeful. The emotions were far more subtle than that. I felt settled. The constant low-grade anxiety that had been my companion for so long was gone. The weight on my shoulders had lifted. I slept through the night for the first time in years. I woke up in the morning and the day was my own, a blank page on which I could write whatever I chose. I took a pottery class. I volunteered at the local library. I took long walks. I discovered the simple, profound peace of solitude. Leo was the only thread I kept from my old life. He had been shocked and confused by what his mother and uncle had done, but he had never once asked me to soften, to forgive, to reconsider. He had simply called and asked, "Grandma, are you okay?" That was all. He drove down from college to visit me in my new condo. He didn't look at me with pity or awe. He just looked at me like I was his grandmother. He helped me set up my new computer and teased me about the number of plants I had. We sat on the balcony drinking tea, and he told me about his classes and the girl he had a crush on. When he was about to leave, he hugged me. "I'm proud of you, Grandma." he said quietly. The words, so simple and sincere, were worth more to me than the entire $1 million insurance policy. He was my family now, a family of two, built on a foundation of simple, honest affection. It was more than enough. Sometimes, when I am watering my plants in the quiet of the morning, I think about the woman I was a year ago, the grieving widow moving through the silent rooms of that big house. She seems like a stranger to me now, a character in a sad story I once read. I feel a sense of pity for her, but also a deep respect. She endured the unthinkable and found the strength to demand the truth. She taught me that it is never too late to reclaim your own life. My life is small now and quiet, but it is mine. Every book I read, every meal I cook, every flower I grow is an act of my own choosing. I have learned that love is not an obligation, and that family is not defined by blood, but by trust. I did not seek revenge. I sought justice. And in the process, I found something far more valuable: peace. I found myself. And I have learned that sometimes the quietest lives are the most free. They thought my life was over. They were wrong. It had just begun.